Lonergan?
Yes.
Okay. The question was, what impact did Newman's writings have on Bernard Lonergan?
Short and sweet answer, I have no idea. Sorry. The only book I've ever read by Lonergan is Insight, and I decided that was one too many.
Father's answer was that Lonergan did read Grammar of Assent a number of times as a student.
If he did, it had no notable effect.
Question in the back, gentlemen.
I guess one of the things that I see is a certain, obviously, a pessimism about the ability to change one's mind. And I read a book a while back about slavery here in the United States as a theological crisis. And one of the arguments put forth in this book was that ultimately this was a theological crisis that was largely decided by force. And so what happened, and when we talk about George Weigel, one of the arguments that he made in one of his books was that ultimately all great issues facing humanity are ultimately theological questions. And so, when I start to look at some of the implications of this argument, is that ultimately, what it might do is contribute to a resort to force when it comes time to settle these issues. And I just want to make sure that is that a reasonable implication?
The gentleman's question was, is the end result of the practice of the methods in the Grammar of Assent?
That's not the question.
Okay.
But that are the implications of this argument going to be that ultimately the great issues of mankind are not going to be settled by debate, but ultimately
by
settled
force.
by force.
Okay, so the question is, will these great issues facing mankind be settled by force rather than by debate if we put into practice what Newman's discussing?
Well, so there's a dichotomy evident in your question. On the one hand, we've got debate. On the other hand, we've got force. That doesn't seem to me a fair mapping of the territory. In other words, if you abandon the former, it's not that you've only got the latter left. So what else have we got? Well, I already mentioned a couple of things. Prayer and fasting. We have the sheer beauty of what the church is. To burnish that beauty and to show it to the world is neither debate nor force. I think there are things deeply embedded in the fabric of the church's beauty that speak against the use of force on matters like this, or matters of foundational disagreement. Therefore, I don't think it follows, or is even suggested by pessimism about the possibilities of conviction produced by debate on the one hand, so we should use force on the other hand. There's all kinds of other things we can do. And those are what we should do. And I hope we're doing them.
It seems this third round also, that's catechesis. And does Newman touch on that in some way? Or?
Yeah. Well, so the question is, what about catechesis then? Doesn't that provide another way of resolving debates? In some ways, yes, it does. Newman is foundationally interested in this. There's catechesis on the one hand for Catholics, there's catechesis on the other hand for the pagans, and then there's catechesis for those in other ecclesial communities, such as the Anglican and so on. Yes, catechesis is fundamental, but we need then a theory of what that is and how it works. And Newman is interesting about this, and he draws here on deep things in the tradition, especially patristic things. The acknowledgement of authority is fundamental for catechesis. And if one acknowledges authority and becomes catechized thereby, Newman would say, one's illative sense starts to work differently. But this takes a while. And it's not something that's got much to do with debate. It's a mode of formation by instruction that requires acknowledgement of authority. So that's very important. Yeah, I agree.
Question in that.
This may sound like a long question, but I'm really looking for a brief answer. Continuing in the idea of catechesis, I'd like to just give you an example and ask you to comment on it. I was working with a child whose mother was very ambivalent about the faith and had about 3 different faith traditions in her background. She did not believe in purgatory. And keeping in mind Newman saying about language, Aristotle's poetics, we can communicate in ways that our language can't really wrap around in prose if we use poetry. This woman, I showed her the dream of Gerontius in text form. I explained some of the symbolism. I wasn't catechizing her. I wasn't trying to do anything. She just was curious about the concept of purgatory, but had become convinced that it wasn't something to believe in. And she was sort of playing devil's advocate with me. I just showed her the dream of Gerontius, pointed out a few passages, and she instantly came to a belief, yes, it must exist. Now, she's not a flighty person. She's something affirmed. There's an assent there. And now she's open to the authority of the church. I just wondered if you could just comment on that within the context of the grammar of assent.
The question for those up front was, what is essentially the nature of catechesis in the grammar of assent, and how is it, if you could help me out here.
How it applies to a very particular anecdotal story here.
How does it-
Middle-aged lady.
How does it apply when in this particular case, this woman was anecdotally passing on information about purgatory? How does that help in a way of catechesis and Newman's, I guess, take on that?
That all the logical arguments didn't get through to her.
Okay.
But reading the dream of Gerontius, once she understood some of the symbolism, all of a sudden she was able to assent to that particular article of faith.
I think you were doing catechesis in a certain way. Most human beings, conservatively 99.9973% of human beings, respond much better to something beautiful than they do to an argument. I'm not that much of a fan of Newman's poetry myself, but that's another question. So I think that catechol method, as the church ought to practice it, ought to be at least as much about showing people beautiful things, whether these be poetic or musical or visual or what have you. People respond to that in ways that the kind of thing Newman does in the grammar, people just don't respond to. So when you show the dream of Gerontius, to display something may bring conviction with it. It certainly may. In fact, it's very common that it does. The best thing the church can do for the world is simply to show itself to the world. And that's, in a sense, what you were doing there. So I think that's a good example of how catechesis ought, and often does, begin. The offering of the syllogism, or the 18-step argument whose conclusion is necessarily God exists. This, it's fine. It's fun for those of us who like that kind of stuff, but it's not the usual thing. It's not what's going to work. So I think that's a good example.
It is 12:15 right now, so for those of you who wish to, I believe that there will be lunch starting to be served over dining hall. We want to thank Dr. Griffiths for entertaining us.